Wyoming, 1893. A cold, gray morning in a small, forgotten town where the wind never stopped howling and the dust never quite settled. The kind of town where people kept their heads down, their mouths shut, and their doors locked after dark. Inside a tiny bakery on the edge of Main Street, a woman stood alone. Her name was Sarah, a widow, a mother, a woman who had built her small world with her own two hands after her husband died and left her with nothing but a broken stove, a bag of flour, and a son to raise. Every morning before the sun rose, she was already awake, already working, already carrying the weight of two lives on one pair of shoulders. She never complained. She never asked for help. She just baked her bread, opened her door, and prayed that today would be a little kinder than yesterday. That morning, as she kneaded her dough in the pale golden light of a single lantern, the front door opened. A stranger walked in, tall, calm, with sharp blue eyes that had seen far too much of the world. He did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He simply sat down, looked at her, and asked for something to eat. She gave it to him. No questions asked. What she did not know, in that quiet, flower-dusted moment, was that the man sitting across from her was the most wanted outlaw in all of America. His name was Butch Cassidy, and just a few hours before he walked through her door, he had saved her son's life. But before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching us from today? Drop your city, your country, right down there in the comments. I love reading every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now, because we bring you real stories like this one, stories that history books forgot to tell every single day. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a single one. Now, let us go back to Wyoming, 1893, and let us understand exactly what kind of world this was. To understand this story, you first have to understand the world in which it happened. Because 1893 was not just any year in American history. It was a year of collapse. The financial panic of 1893 had shattered the American economy like glass. Banks were closing. Railroads were going bankrupt. Thousands of working men were losing their jobs overnight, walking out of factories and mines with empty pockets and no idea where their next meal was coming from. In the big cities, people stood in bread lines that stretched around the block. But in the small towns of Wyoming, there were no bread lines. There was just silence, and hunger, and a kind of quiet desperation that never made it into the newspapers. Wyoming in 1893 was still, in many ways, the Wild West. The law existed on paper, but in practice, it was thin and unreliable. Sheriffs were underpaid and often corrupt. Cattle barons controlled entire counties. The gap between the rich and the poor was not just wide, it was violent. If you had land and cattle and money, the law protected you. If you had none of those things, you were on your own. For a widow like Sarah, life in this world was especially brutal. Her husband had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind nothing but debt. She had no family nearby, no savings, no safety net, so she did the only thing she could do. She opened a bakery, a small, humble place with 4 tables, a wood-fired oven, and the kind of bread that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. It was not a glamorous life, but it was hers. She protected it fiercely, and she protected her son, Thomas, even more fiercely. Thomas was 19 years old in 1893, young, restless, and angry in the way that young men without fathers and without futures tend to get angry. Sarah worried about him every single day. She could feel him slipping toward the wrong crowd, toward the wrong choices. She prayed every night that something or someone would pull him back before it was too late. She had no idea that her prayer was about to be answered in the most unexpected way imaginable. Now let us talk about the man who walked through her door. His real name was Robert Leroy Parker. He was born in 1866 in Beaver, Utah. the oldest of 13 children in a poor Mormon farming family. From the very beginning, life handed him very little. Hard work, not enough food, and a father who struggled to keep the family together. By the time Robert was a teenager, he had already learned one painful truth about the world. The system was not built for people like him. He fell in with a cattle rustler named Butch Cassidy as a young man, and it was from him that he borrowed his famous alias. From that point forward, Robert Leroy Parker disappeared, and Butch Cassidy was born. By 1893, Butch Cassidy was already a legend. He had robbed banks. He had robbed trains. He had outsmarted sheriffs, marshals, and Pinkerton detectives across multiple states. He was clever, fast, and almost impossibly charming. People who met him often said the same thing. He did not seem like a criminal. He seemed like someone's favorite uncle. Someone who could make you laugh, make you feel at ease, and then vanish before you realized what had happened. But there was something else about Butch Cassidy that set him apart from the typical outlaw of his era. He had a code, a personal unwritten rule that he followed with remarkable consistency. He never hurt innocent people. In a time when outlaws were often brutal and indiscriminate, Cassidy was almost surgical in his targets. Banks, railroads, the powerful, the wealthy, never the poor, never the defenseless. His gang, known as the Wild Bunch, and sometimes called the Hole in the Wall Gang after their famous hideout in the Wyoming mountains, was one of the most successful criminal organizations in American history. They were disciplined, organized, and loyal to one another, and Cassidy was their leader, not because he was the most dangerous man among them, but because he was the smartest. In 1893, Cassidy was moving through Wyoming carefully, staying low, avoiding attention. He had just pulled off a successful operation and was now in the cooling-off period, passing through small towns, keeping to himself, watching everything with those calm, calculating eyes. He was, in every sense of the word, a ghost, moving through a world that was always looking for him and never quite finding him. Until one night outside a small Wyoming town, something happened that even he could not walk away from. Thomas was a young man who made the mistake that so many young men in desperate times have made throughout history. He borrowed money from the wrong people. It had started simply enough, a small debt to a local moneylender, a hard man with a harder crew of men who worked for him. Thomas had borrowed to help his mother cover a month when the bakery's earnings fell short. He had been certain he could pay it back. He had been wrong. By October of 1893, the debt had grown, swollen with cruel interest, into something Thomas could not possibly repay. The moneylender's men had started coming around, first with warnings, then with threats. Thomas had told no one, least of all his mother. He was ashamed. He was scared. And on that particular cold night, he made the worst decision of his young life. He agreed to meet the moneylender's men out on the edge of town to try to negotiate man to man. It was a trap, of course, the kind of trap that desperate young men have been walking into since the beginning of time. There were 3 of them waiting for him in the dark. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to deliver a message, the kind of message that is written in bruises and broken bones. What happened next is the part of this story that history only preserved in fragments and whispers. But what we know is this. Butch Cassidy was passing through that area on horseback, moving quietly through the dark, when he heard the sounds of what was unfolding. He could have kept riding. Any sensible outlaw would have kept riding. Getting involved meant attention. It meant risk. It meant exactly the kind of trouble he had spent years learning to avoid, but he did not keep riding. He rode toward the sound instead. Exactly what he said or did in those dark moments, no one recorded precisely. But the outcome was clear. The 3 men left. Thomas was shaken, bruised in places, but alive and whole and breathing. And the stranger who had appeared from nowhere in the darkness did not wait for thanks. He asked the young man if he was all right, told him to go home to his mother, and then turned his horse around and disappeared back into the night. Thomas walked home trembling. He told no one what had happened. He went to bed and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the stranger who had appeared from nowhere and then vanished like smoke. The morning arrived cold and pale, the way Wyoming mornings always did in October. Sarah was up before first light, as always, feeding wood into the oven, mixing her dough, wrapping herself in the familiar rhythm of work that had kept her sane through all her hardest years. She did not know her son had almost not come home last night. Thomas was asleep upstairs, finally, after hours of lying awake. She assumed he was simply tired. She let him sleep and went on with her morning. The bakery door opened just after 7. The man who stepped inside looked like the road had been hard on him. His coat was dusty. His boots were worn. There were lines around his eyes that came not from age, but from vigilance, from years of always watching, always listening, always being ready to move. He took off his hat when he came inside, which Sarah noticed. Not many men remembered to do that. He sat down at the table nearest the window. He looked out at the street for a moment with those calm, unreadable eyes. Then he looked at her and said quietly that he would be grateful for whatever she had. She brought him bread, still warm from the oven. She brought him coffee, strong and black. She set it all in front of him without a word, in the way that good people feed strangers, without ceremony and without expectation. He ate slowly. He did not rush. He looked at the bread the way a man looks at something that reminds him of somewhere safe, somewhere from long ago. And for just a few minutes, in that small, warm bakery that smelled of flour and wood smoke, Butch Cassidy was not an outlaw. He was just a tired man eating breakfast. They spoke a little. Sarah asked him if he was passing through. He said yes. She asked if he had family somewhere. He smiled at that, a small, careful smile, and said that was a complicated question. She nodded, because she was the kind of woman who understood complicated answers. He paid her, more than the food was worth. He left it on the table, without drawing attention to it, the way a man does when he wants to be generous without making someone feel pitied. He stood, put his hat back on, and walked to the door. He paused there for just a moment, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been guilt, something that might have been peace, something that was probably both. Then he walked out into the cold morning air and was gone. Later that same morning, Thomas finally came downstairs. He sat across from his mother at the very table where the stranger had been sitting just hours before, and slowly, haltingly, because he had carried it alone long enough, he told her everything. The debt, the men, the darkness at the edge of town, the stranger who had appeared from nowhere. Sarah listened without interrupting. Her hands were still in her lap. Her face was very still. When Thomas finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked him to describe the man. Tall, Thomas said. Blue eyes. Calm. Very calm. The kind of calm that made you feel like nothing could shake him. Sarah looked at the table, at the coins still sitting there, at the cup the man had drunk from. There were wanted posters in Wyoming. Everyone had seen them. And slowly, piece by piece, like a picture coming into focus, she understood. What she felt in that moment was not a simple thing. There was fear in it, certainly. The man was an outlaw, a fugitive, a man the law had been chasing for years. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Something quieter and more complicated. Gratitude. Deep, genuine, overwhelming gratitude. This man, this wanted criminal, had saved her son's life in the dark. And then, the very next morning, he had sat in her bakery and eaten her bread and left without ever saying a word about what he had done. She never saw him again, but she told the story carefully, quietly, to people she trusted. And the story lived on, passed from person to person, the way true stories always do, not in newspapers or history books, but in the mouths of ordinary people who understood something that history sometimes misses, that goodness and badness rarely come in pure, unmixed forms. History has given us Butch Cassidy the outlaw, the bank robber, the train robber, the man who eventually fled to South America with his partner the Sundance Kid. And all of that is true, but history has been less careful about recording the other things. The farmers he helped when cattle barons tried to run them off their land, the small debts he quietly paid off for struggling families, the moments scattered across years and states when people who had nothing found that someone had left something for them, money, food, supplies, with no name and no explanation. Was Butch Cassidy a good man? That is not quite the right question. He was a complicated man, which is what most real human beings are. He lived outside the law. He stole. He built his life on things that caused real harm to real institutions. But he also carried, somewhere inside himself, a genuine feeling for the powerless, a hatred of cruelty, a refusal to use his strength against people who were already broken. The system that existed in 1893 America was not a fair one. That does not make robbery right, but it does make the picture more complicated than a simple story of a villain. Butch Cassidy exists in that complicated space, and that is exactly why, more than 100 years later, we are still talking about him. Sarah lived for many more years after that October morning. The bakery survived. Thomas survived. He eventually found steady work, paid off what remained of his debt, and never again made the mistake of borrowing from men who used fear as their currency. Sarah never told the full story publicly in her lifetime. It was too dangerous, and besides, it was not the kind of story that fit neatly into any category that people were comfortable with. But her grandchildren remembered it, and their children remembered it from them. What she took away from that morning was something simple and very hard to argue with. That a stranger had saved her son not for reward, not for recognition, not for anything at all, and then sat at her table and eaten her bread and never said a word. And she had fed him, not because she knew who he was, but because he was hungry and it was cold, and that was enough of a reason. 2 acts of ordinary human kindness in a world that was very short on kindness that year. That, in the end, is what the story is really about. We spend a lot of time trying to sort people into categories, good and bad, hero and villain, worthy and unworthy, and sometimes those categories are useful, but sometimes life sends you a story like this one, and the categories fall apart, and what you are left with is something much more honest. The story is still here, still breathing, still asking us the question it has always been asking. What kind of person do you choose to be when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed? That is the only question that has ever really mattered. And on that note, I want to hear from you. Did this story surprise you? Did it change the way you think about Butch Cassidy? Tell me everything in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, stories that history almost forgot, stories about real people who did extraordinary things in ordinary moments, then subscribe right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a single video, because the best stories, they are always the ones nobody expected to tell.